Welcome to Nextcasts, where we take you on a thrilling journey into the heart of innovation, urban development, and the future of our bustling cities. I'm your host, Emilia, CEO of Swissnex in San Francisco, and this is the METROPOLIS season. So good morning. We're recording right now. So welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. Good morning.
As you know, our podcast is Nextcast. It's the METROPOLIS season that we're recording for the 20th anniversary of Swissnex in San Francisco. If you agree, I suggest we start, with the basic. Could you just tell us who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name is David DeChambrier. I am one of the co-founders of Vuna Nexus. We are a startup that focuses on recycling the nutrients from urine, whether it's a human or livestock urine. And I have a background in sales and operations, mostly startups. And lately I worked for Google in Zurich.
Okay, so when you say you recycle urine, how do we understand this? So what is actually happening there?
Yeah, so it's a pretty uncommon subject to talk about, but it's actually quite important because urine contains up to 80% of what a wastewater treatment plant is trying to treat. So it contains the micropollutants, a lot of the nutrients, etc., etc. And so at ERWAG, which is the Water Institute of the Polytechnical Schools of Switzerland, there's been a lot of research on how can we decentralize wastewater treatment and how can we find ways to make it more efficient. And so, coming from this technology, we started this company that focuses on this.
How did you come up with the idea? Was it a meeting with a researcher, or is it a topic, water, that has been following you over the years?
Yeah, it's a topic. Water that has been following us, but really it's coming from research. So really originally, there's been a research project at ERWAG that was called the Vuna project, and the idea was to recycle the nutrients in areas around the world where there's very no sanitation or no wastewater treatment systems at all. And how can we recycle these nutrients in order to then bring back this nutrient to earth in a safe way for local farmers? And so this research project was in South Africa. And from this research project came basically our company.
So basically it was conceived as a development project, but actually you kind of bringing it back to make a company to the Western world. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, in essence, the technology right now is at a stage, still at a relatively early stage. So in terms of cost, for example, at the stage we're right now, it's more, let's say, affordable, or let's say more realistic to install it here in Switzerland or in very dense cities that are struggling with the wastewater. But our goal is to then go back and be able to bring the cost down to a point where we can also use this technology back where it was originally made for.
Mm-hmm. And what is so when you go to, who are your clients, maybe? Can you tell us this? Is it someone who is building a new house? And what is your sales pitch? How do you convince them to recycle the urine?
Yeah. So the sales pitch is... let's say our clients mostly right now are real estate developers that develop large buildings, let's say buildings that host more than 500 people. And more often than not, and we can see this, for example, in Paris, cities have their wastewater treatment system saturated. And so the densification is a challenge for a lot of cities around the world. And people are now more and more looking for solutions that are decentralized in order to reduce the load that is ending on the wastewater treatment plant. So our sales pitch is kind of, we are approaching a building developer, and we are suggesting the installation of our technology, of urine treatment technology, often in parallel than other technologies, such as grey water treatment, for example. That is something that is now being done quite a lot in San Francisco and in other cities around the world. And what we do is we install our process in the basement. It's a relatively simple process. It's basically a bioreactor. And so the process is completely autonomous. And so we recycle these nutrients and we produce a fertilizer. That fertilizer is called urine, and it's certified on the Swiss market, but also in the European Union as a mineral fertilizer. So it's the same fertilizer as you would buy anywhere, really. It's an NPK. And so the model right now is that we are proving that recycling nutrients in a building can make financial sense. And so by recycling the urine and reselling the fertilizer, we can then pay a rent to the building owner that will then reimburse the original investment. So I often compare this to solar panels that can be installed on buildings that then generate revenue for the building owner. Although we are still in the early days, so right now it's still a pretty expensive investment, and the return on investment might be a bit longer than it will be in 10 or 15 years.
And with the remaining water, what are the one of my main question would have been then what challenges have you faced on your path? And I can imagine that could you drink this water that is recycled, and what is the reaction of people?
Yes. So at the end of our process, we have a distillation. And so the distillation is quite important because it allows us to concentrate the nutrients, but then also pasteurize the liquid. So all pathogens or any living organism doesn't survive this process. And so at the end, we have a distilled water. If we were treating it a little bit more, we could potentially make it a drinkable water, but most of the minerals are out. So usually what we do is we re-inject this water in the grey water system of the building. So it could be the rainwater, for example, that is used for watering or for dishwashers or anything like this. And else buildings that don't have a grey water system, the water is just then sent back to the centralized treatment system.
Mm-hmm. I'm asking this because I was told by one of my colleagues here at Swissnex in San Francisco that she attended a panel with a couple of astronauts saying that in space, apparently, the water that they drink have been gone through many people many times. And I was wondering if you ever had discussions maybe with this type of stakeholders.
Yes, absolutely. So part of the research has been financed by the Melissa Foundation. The Melissa Foundation is a foundation that is linked to the European Space Agency and focuses on developing systems that will enable life on other planets. So basically, part of our research is intended to be then used in space at some point.
Mm-hmm. If we start to zoom out a little bit, I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about the ecosystem in the area of water recycling? Are there other startups? Is there a lot of research currently? What is exactly the state of the art?
So the state of the art right now, so we often compare wastewater, at least in Switzerland, but also mostly in Europe. It's a bit like the energy market, like it was probably 15, 20 years ago. Everything is very centralized through state institutions that are in charge of treating the wastewater. So it's actually quite hard to push new technologies in this market for the reason that the legislation doesn't really allow it more often than not. And so in terms of state in the art, I think it really depends on a city per city cases and on the needs of each cities. But we can see in Paris, for example, because they're organizing the Olympics, they're investing a lot in decentralized treatment system, whether they're gray water or whether they're yellow water, so urine or black waters. Because right now the reality is that a lot of the wastewater is then thrown in the Seine River, and it's extremely polluting. So state of the art, there are some startup out there that are doing grey water recycling. The urine world is a relatively small world. A lot of researchers talking to each other and sharing different technologies at different scale. And black water is still, a lot of it, it's still, I would say, in research.
Just to make sure that our audience understand, could you maybe just tell us the difference exactly between grey water, black water, and clean water?
Sorry. So yellow water is basically urine mixed with water. And then we have grey water. Grey water is usually everything that comes from dishwashers or showers or water that is slightly polluted but really not very hard to treat. And then we have the black waters that are for example, with feces or oils or things like this.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this explanation. When you were talking about Paris, let me come back to that. Do you know how the situation is in the US and maybe in San Francisco? How is the legislation there, and what are the main differences?
So in San Francisco, I've been told not so long ago, 2 weeks ago actually, that there's a legislation that forces all new buildings, at least large-scale buildings, to have a grey water system, a grey water treatment system in the building. So that means you get the fresh water for your showers, for your kitchen, for everything. That fresh water goes in a grey water tank in the basement of your building, is treated, and then re-injected in your toilets, for example, in the flushing systems of your toilet. And in that way, the water is already used twice. So that's already a big progress, because in terms of the infrastructure and the planning of buildings, it makes architects and urbanists and engineers understand that having multiple systems and having some parts of the treatment done in a building is possible and is not completely unrealistic. So I think for me, this is really a good sign. In Paris, there are a lot of subsidies that are given to our systems, for example. And then we can see this as well in Geneva, where the state is starting to reduce the taxes on buildings that are treating their own wastewater.
I was about to ask you, what does it take to implement your solution? So in your sales pitch, there are some financial investment for owners of building, but it also seems that the state has an important role. I mean, if there is no push, you were talking about subsidies, about less taxes or new legislation. Do you think that there is a need for more, let's say, regulation, generally speaking, in this area? Is it possible to implement that without having an action of the state?
So right now it's possible to implement it. It's just mainly early adopters of the technology are more like on the visionary type of customers. So for them, the cost is less of an issue, and they're doing this because they believe it's the right thing to do. So that's really who our customers are right now. I think in the future, the legislation will have to change to enable this. One of the main issues we have right now, is not really an issue, but one of the main problems we have right now is that the wastewater treatment tax is a percentage of the clear water. So every time you buy fresh water, like 1 cubic meter of fresh water, there is a percentage of this that is a tax that will then be able to, the state will then be used to treat that wastewater. And so until we get that tax on the effluent, what's coming out of the building and not what's coming in the building, we'll have issues. So to illustrate this, some large projects in Geneva, for example, they are trying to use rainwater to flush their toilets, which seems pretty logical. The problem is then the wastewater treatment plant will have to treat a water on which they haven't got any money from, because they're getting water from the sky that is free and that is not taxed. Then they refuse this kind of projects because they won't get paid for their work, basically. So I would say that the main legislative problem right now is the way this tax is structured, and we should tax on what is sent to the wastewater treatment plant instead of on what we actually buy.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the incentive is somehow set wrong. It's a very interesting question.
Yeah,
If I, you were talking about the fact that it was the early adopters that were using your solutions. Since you are one of the founder of this company, of the Vuna Nexus, I was wondering, what is your vision if we think not just about the water recycling, but much more about the future of cities? You were talking a lot about decentralization. How do you think, like in 30 years from now, how do you think a city should look like?
I think in terms of wastewater, a city should look like, so we should treat a lot of our waste in a decentralized way. So similar to what is done with batteries or PET or glass, where at home you separate the feeds before sending them to incineration or something like this. If you separate these feeds, it's then way easier to recycle. And I think in the future and where it's possible, I by no means think that every building in the future will have urine and feces treatments locally, because it doesn't necessarily apply everywhere. But in the future, I think very dense cities will have to have decentralized wastewater treatment. But if we don't only speak about wastewater, I think it's more water in general. So rainwater collection is a must. I mean, the fact that nowadays we still use fresh water to flush our toilets is a complete nonsense. And although we really focus, and a lot of the word out there is concerning the CO2 and the global warming, we kind of like don't realize that every day when we urinate, 250 milliliters, we flush that with 5, 6, 7, 10 liters of fresh water, which is a complete nonsense. And I think rainwater will be a first. Using the water at least twice in a building will be an absolute must in the future. And then where possible and where interesting, potentially having some of these waste treated directly on site. Research, for example, at EAVAG is trying to show that the feces can be dried in the building and then compressed into heating pellets. And so within your building, you could have a system that heats the building with feces pellets that have been dried, exactly like wood pellets, except that they're just feces pellets, basically.
Do you believe, what is very interesting it's a very circular approach as well, right? Do you believe that each building, ideally speaking, should be entirely autonomous and self-sufficient? Do you have this vision that each big building should have its roof garden and should grow its own vegetables? And is that something we should try to achieve?
I'm personally not having this dream. I mean, it would be really fantastic, but I think that we will need to adapt to what we have right now. And so a lot of the buildings will need to be refurbished, and we'll need to prolong the life of this building as long as we can, because that's the most ecological way of thinking about things. And so our vision as a company is more where it makes sense, we can install systems. And often we even refuse systems because we think that it's not going to fit that particular building, or the density of the population is not good enough in that area, or for various reasons. And I think it will be more on a case by case, in my opinion. And except if you were to start a building like a city from scratch, I think we'll have to adapt to different environments. So you can't do rainwater collection everywhere, for example. You need to have certain types of roofs, and you need to have certain types of urbanism and areas to store that water, etc., etc. So in my opinion, it will be more like a mix of different technologies that all talk to each other and that kind of all work together. So a building could be collecting rainwater for other buildings, for example, and maybe a building will have a roof garden to feed other buildings because it will be more adapted to this use. That's more the dynamic I envision.
Okay, so it'd be not each building being self-sufficient, but kind of more of a community, because right now we know that cities are importing, food, vegetables, everything is because of the density, right? So we could still imagine a system where we would have building and houses that would kind of have different functions, like probably a state, but just at a small scale. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the direction it's taking, especially for our technology and similar technologies, is more and more we have we have cities approaching us. They have new developments of eco neighborhoods, for example. We have one in Berlin that is 300,000 square meters. I don't know how many feet meters it is, but they are like very large neighborhoods, and they're thinking about separating urine not on a building scale, but on a neighborhood scale. And the same thing with the solar, and the same thing with the heating, and having smaller plants for neighborhoods.
Are there other, you were talking about the solar system, about the recycling possibilities. Are there other areas that you can think of where this decentralization process is taking place in the construction or building?
Well, I mean, some of the research, so the institute next to us, which is the EMPA, which is the Material Institute of the Polytechnical School of Switzerland, is doing a lot of research on recuperation of building materials, for example. So instead of throwing them away, you get the windows back, and you get some part of the walls and maybe the carpets. And they do a lot of research on how can we reuse some of these materials as locally as possible to rebuild new things. And so I think that's a very interesting thing. Yes, an interesting.
Mm-hmm. And if we had to give one advice to people who are listening to us right now about what can they do in their everyday life to contribute to a more sustainable urban future, what would you tell them to do?
That's a hard one. Think about what's happening when you flush the toilet. I'm staying in my subject, but think about it. I'm not an engineer, and I'm not like an environmental engineer trained in wastewater. So I've just I landed in this world maybe 3-4 years ago, and I'm realizing now that everything that is happening there we just have no idea. Make a little bit of research, look into what is happening every time you flush the toilet, and think about that. Think about the network and the infrastructure that the city has in place to do something with this waste when they do something with it. And maybe don't flush the toilets if you just urinate 250 milliliters and that you have an old toilet that flushes it with 20 liters of water. Maybe not. Maybe just do it next time, or like.
Okay, I don't know for people living in sharing apartment how this recommendation will.
I don't know.
Will be, but thank you for that, and I think we'll all then think about VunaNexus a couple of times per day probably. Well, I think we're about pretty much at the end of our talk. So I really wanted to thank you, David, for taking the time, for sharing your story with us. We're also very excited to have you soon with us in San Francisco. And yes, thank you for participating for this Nextcast Metropolis season.
Thank you so much.
And looking forward to seeing you soon.
Looking forward to see you soon too.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you, you too. Bye-bye. This episode was part of the Metropolis season, where we celebrate Swissnex in San Francisco's 20th anniversary. Find out more about the anniversary and upcoming events by Swissnex in San Francisco in the show notes. Stay tuned for the next episode and see you at one of our upcoming events.